Hello and welcome to this video lecture on Chapter 11. Hopefully by the time we get through with this chapter and you read this chapter, you'll understand what business rules are, the different categories of business rules, how do you go about defining and establishing business rules, and then validation tables. And this will give you a good insight in terms of how when a business comes up with its rules, how can a database use to implement those rules and make sure that we're actually not um, not avoiding, but making sure that we're collecting data that's within the business rules and that our data is good and we can use that to make decisions with. So for those of you that continue on and use what the information you've learned in your data analytics classes, you'll probably be doing some form of data analysis or being a data analyst. And so you're going to play a critical role in terms of defining those business rules. And you may even have to use those business rules in order to do your analysis. And so one thing that you're going to have to do and be very good at is to communicate. You need to communicate with everybody that's involved and let them know why and how you're doing something. And as you relate this to your business degree, it may be that these business rules, when you examine them, may not even support the strategy that the organization's trying to accomplish. And so you're going to have to communicate and help the organization define new business rules or change the existing business rules. So when we think about making sure that all the data is correct and we're going to use that to make those decisions, we need to be thinking about the overall data integrity. So one thing we need to make sure of is that we have a sound table and field structures. We've defined what we mean by a table, a person, place, or thing, or an event. They're called entities in logical database design. They become a table when we get to the physical database design. We've talked about field structures, how they need to all relate to that primary key and only be about that entity. They shouldn't have multi-part or multi-valued pieces of data within that field and so on. So you may need to go back and review some of your other chapters if you would. It needs to have consistent and basically valid data entry. So we've talked about how to do that. You've seen that in some of your assignments. When you're putting limits on what can go into your database, you might want to also mask that input field so the user knows how that data needs to be structured. Examples would be like a phone or a social security number, so on. Another component would be meaningful and properly established table relationships. Without having those relationships established, you're not going to be able to pull data that's related across multiple tables. And remember, the reason why we have multiple tables is because we don't want to have redundant and overly duplicated data in our database because it makes it difficult to update or change that data when we're doing our queries and such in terms of trying to get the correct information back out. And the last part are these business rules. And business rules are a statement that imposes some form or constraint on a specific aspect of the database. Maybe somebody can't take more than 5 classes in a semester. That would be a rule. Well, how do you make sure that that doesn't happen in the database that allows that data to be entered and then now you violated the business rule, and what do you do? So that would be one example. Or if you're doing it for a medical office, you can't have more than 2 visits in a day. I don't know if that's a rule or not, but it might be something that you need to have that database reflect. And that's what we're talking about here. So another way of saying that is a business rule can impact the field specification for a particular field or the characteristics of a given relationship. Give an example of that in the past in terms of we don't want to let somebody register for a course unless they are admitted to the university. Well, that's a business rule. So how do you implement that in the database? One way to implement that is to make sure that the referential integrity between one table requires that the primary key exists in another table. So student to courses. So from the courses table, that primary key back to the student table would need to exist. That would be this type of business rule. With that being said, then you need to base that business rule on the way the organization perceives and uses its data. So as you're creating that database, you need to determine what data to store. That's going to be helping you in your business rules. That doesn't mean that you want to store every piece of data the organization might possibly use. And what you're seeing on my screen here is a link to my cloud storage that's losing connectivity and it keeps blanking out. But you can still hear my voice, hopefully. So as you're thinking about what kind of data you want to collect, you don't want to be putting in pieces of data that you might never use, and so that becomes a big waste of time. It's the data that you finally do choose to use in your database and store, and that will determine the way the organization uses that data. So business rules then influence the following database issues. One is the type of data you collect and store. Another is how you define and establish those relationships. The types of information the database can provide. And then lastly, the security and confidentiality of the data. And what we mean by that last item there is when you put data into a database, you can have certain read, write, and execute privileges on each field. And so that means maybe you have forms that you only want to allow certain people with certain privileges to view certain pieces of data that are in a table. An example might, if you're in HR, you might want to allow people to enter information into a table, but you never want them to see all the information that's in that table. Example might be salaries or hourly wage. You might want to let them enter the data, but you never want them to go and see what somebody else's hourly wage or salary was. So in that case, they might have write privileges, but they won't have any read privileges. And then that adds to the security and confidentiality of that data. Business rules are specific to an organization. You know, I've given you a lot of rules that are specific to maybe higher education or even WKU. And so they may change from university to university, and they'll be different with different types of organization. So just keep in mind that each organization has its own data and information requirements and its own unique way of conducting business. Now, early on, we talked about, when you redefine a database or you want to redo a database, you don't want to use the same database structure because you're just going to copy the same problems that you've had from the previous database. Well, the same thing happens here with business rules. Business rules may change over time, and you have to go back in and look at how you structured your database, and you'll have to make changes. And so that may be a reason why you need to do an entirely new database, or you need to go in and make those small little changes. Some other examples of a business rule that you might see is something like a ship date cannot be prior to an order date for any given order. That just makes sense. So you put that in as a field specification. Another business rule might be a student cannot have more than 2 instruments checked out at the same time. So that relates to a degree of participation between two tables. So you'd be able to limit that if you did a count on that output, and then you could say, well, you can't check out any more right now because you've already got 2 checked out. The library may have similar rules for the number of books you can check out. So there are 2 types of business rules. One is database-oriented business rules, and these are the ones that impose constraints that you set up when you're starting to do your logical design of the database. So you can implement that constraint by modifying various field specification elements, relationship characteristics. That's where we have that relationship window, and you can see how you could connect the 2 or more tables. Or it could be a combination of the 2. Maybe you have some different field specification elements and then how they're connected. Field specification elements, we've seen a couple of different ways where we could do lookup tables. Maybe we want to make sure that certain data could go into that field and we don't want the user typing in anything extraneous. So we would have a table that just has the items that they can choose from, and that way we've implemented that constraint. So a business rule is a database oriented if you can meaningfully and clearly establish the constraints within the database. Right? So it has to be something that you can do within the database. So if you can't establish the rule within the database, that is, it's not database oriented, then it becomes an application oriented business rule. So that's the second type. So when you have this type and you can't do it within the database, you have to do it within the physical design of the database or within the design of the database application. And so a business rule is application oriented when it's more meaningful and clear to establish the constraint within the application. So when we look at the categories of business rules, we have 2 primary categories. Those are business rules are field specific and relationship specific. Field specific business rules are under this category when you are having some kind of constraint on a field. And so the number of elements a given rule affects depend on the manner in which you define the rule. So it could be more than one field. So an example might be order dates to be displayed in long form, such as January 10th, 2012. And so you saw in our table design, we had the ability to select the type of data that was going to go in there and how it would be displayed, I should say. So there's more than one way to display a certain date, but in this case, we want it displayed like this. So sometimes those field-specific business rules can impact more than one element or more than one field. And so an example might be when you're storing the zip code for Canadian customers. So with Canadian customers, the zip codes include letters, and so now are you going to just include the data type being short text, or is it going to be numbers? And so you got to choose a data type that can handle both types of data that's going to be going into that field. The other category of business rule is this relationship-specific business rule. So under this category, the constraints affect the characteristics of the relationship, or sometimes that degree of participation. So it could be, is it optional to have a related piece of data in another table, or does it require one and only one, or does it require, it can have many types of relationships there. So an example that you might have as a relationship-specific business rule would be each class must have a minimum of 5 students but can have no more than 20. So how do you implement that? That's the idea of having business rules and then using that database to help you achieve those business rules. Next thing I want to talk about is defining and establishing those business rules. So just keep in mind those business rules are based on how the organization perceives and uses its data. And so that then depends on the way the organization functions or conducts its business. And so in order to get that information, you're going to work closely with different users and management to establish those appropriate business rules for the database. So remember, we had 2 categories of business rules: field-specific rules and relationship-specific rules. And so if we're going to establish a field-specific rule, we need to think about, okay, where does that data reside? So we're going to figure out which table that is, review each field and determine whether it requires any constraints, then define the necessary business rules for that field. And so as we're creating that table, yeah, we can create a basic structure, but then we need to go back and also think about how do we implement that business rule. And so this is just giving you how to think about going in there and setting up those constraints. Then think about different scenarios or actions that are going to test that rule. And then write down why you set it up a certain way and what the rule is doing. And so when you're in Access, under your descriptions, you can write that in there of what you're doing and what has been done so that somebody coming after you will know. A lot of times, a lot of problems could be avoided if there was just enough good documentation. If you're setting up a relationship-specific rule, what you'll need to do is select the relationship, review the relationship, and determine what are the requirements or any constraints that you have there. Define that business rule for the relationship. Usually you're going to say, is it one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many? Many-to-many, you're going to have an intermediate table so you can connect up to one-to-many relationships. And that's just a side note there. Then after you've defined that rule for that relationship, then you're going to establish a rule by modifying those relationships between the 2 tables. Then think about what's going to test the action between the rule, and then again document. In terms of what we've seen with relationships, if you go to that relationship panel, you can determine whether if one field needs to exist, again the primary field, does that data need to exist before I can enter data in another table. And that's just the classic example of a specific relationship rule. The last topic that we wanted to talk about and make sure you understood in this chapter was validation tables. And they can be very effective in terms of their use and being able to define field-specific business rules, especially when you can limit the number or valid values for a given field. So again, the example is like if you only wanted people to enter valid zip codes, you might have a whole table that just has valid zip codes in it they could choose from. Or if you wanted, let's say you're working in HR and you needed them to look for a certain employee, well, you could look by ID or you could look by name. And so that could be a lookup value that's populated from another table. And I think even in this week's homework assignment, we're actually using a lookup value. We're manually setting that up so they can just enter USA and some other value for country code. And so that would be an example of a validation table. So keep in mind that a validation table stores data that's usually specifically used to implement this data integrity and data consistency. And so you typically won't do any inserts, updates, or deletes. So an insert is the command in SQL to add a new record. So typically that's going to be built for you, and you won't have to modify it very much afterwards. A lot of times that validation table will be made up of two fields. The first one acts as the primary key of the table, and the second one is simply the non-key field that has the values that are required in your database. So let's say, again, I wanted to link up to the employee table. Well, that validation table might have the employee's ID and their actual name. And so it's the name that gets put into another field, but I'm actually linking that to the table I'm working on through that primary key field, and I hide that field from the user so they don't see it on their screen. So when you're actually implementing a business rule with a validation table, it's going to require two steps. One is you have to define the relationship between the table with the effective field and the validation table. So that's why you typically will have a link to the primary key field in this validation table. Then the second step is you're going to make modifications to the range of value elements of the field specification for the effective field. So what does that mean? It means you're going to have to make sure that the data types in that validation table that you're going to use to populate the field in the other table match up. And so you got to make sure that those values from the validation table will match the same values and data type in your table that you're updating, and making sure the correct data is getting into the database. That ends the discussion on Chapter 11. Please make sure you read through that and ask me any questions if you have some about the concepts in this chapter.